Hello there, everyone. This conversation is and will be held in English. The main reason why I am pretty nervous here is that on the other side of my wire is a person who is responsible for many people in the Eastern Bloc, and probably not only from the Eastern Bloc, and who is responsible for their English language skills. On the other side is sitting Mr. Tom Hutchinson. Hello, Tom.
Hi.
I'd like to say it again, and I will say it probably it once more. Thank you, sir, because you were one of the first and one of the first authors of the English books, which were based on communicative language teaching, I guess.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate it. And I appreciate it even more since I'm an English teacher, or I'd like to call myself an English teacher. But first of all, the first question during my conversation is, how would you describe it? Imagine, how would you describe yourself? Imagine you are stopped by a person on a street, and the person asks you, "What do you do for a living?"
Right. Well, strangely enough, it would be easier to explain that to somebody who's not British, because any other country, such as the Czech Republic, everybody learns English. And so if I said I write the textbooks that you learn English from, they would know what I'm talking about. But of course, here in Britain, that's not the case. So if I say I write books for teaching English, I have to explain it because most people in Britain really don't know a great deal about teaching English as a foreign language. So, but essentially that's what I have to say. Well, what I do is I write books that are used in schools and various other places around the world for teaching English as a foreign language. It's the equivalent of the book you would use in school here for learning French or German or something like that, with stories, grammar explanations, exercises, that sort of thing. Most people are quite amazed by it when I tell them, because it's an area of work they'd never even thought existed. So.
Let's say, can you be more specific for the layman, such as I am? What are the differences? Let's say if you have a book dealing with English for English people and English used for English as a foreign language.
Right. Well, there's a considerable difference at the lower levels. At the higher levels, it's not so different. Once you get up into advanced English, then the difference between a book for native speakers and a book for foreign learners is not that great, because you're concerned with things like reading texts and analysing the text and so on. But obviously at the more basic level, you've got to teach people the grammar, you've got to teach people basic vocabulary, you've got to give them lots of practice in trying to put the words together and say very ordinary things. So that's essentially the difference, that the book for teaching English to British students assumes they know how to speak English. So yeah, that's the basic difference.
Let's ask, what was your journey to this kind of profession you have, to the profession of book writing and the book writing of this special field?
Well, it was a fairly roundabout kind of journey, if you like. I actually, my first degree, I studied at Oxford, was history. I'm actually a history graduate. And I started teaching history in a school here in Britain. but as I say, I always decided there was no future in history. So
that's a great motto, yeah.
But I'd always been very, very interested in languages. I'd studied French and German and Latin at school, and so and always enjoyed them. So I liked languages. And as it happened, the school I was teaching in London had an exchange with a school in Germany, Western Germany, as it was in those days. And they had an exchange visit, and I went out to Germany with the school, and met there a teacher who was British, but who was teaching English in a German school, in a gymnasium in Germany. And he said there was an organization which provided teachers of English to German schools because they had a big shortage of English teachers, particularly in the Ruhr area, the industrial area, where none of the German teachers didn't seem to want to live there because it was an industrial zone. And so I thought, well, that sounds like quite a good idea. So I got in touch with that and went out to teach in Germany for 2 years as a gymnasium there in a place called Oberhausen. I'd studied German at school, so I knew a bit of the language, so I was able to do that. And I really enjoyed it. I thought this was a much nicer way of earning a living than trying to teach history. So I thought, well, I'd better get some sort of better qualification in this. So I then applied to Lancaster University in Britain and did an MA in applied linguistics for language teaching. And on the strength of that, I got a job out in what was Yugoslavia, Croatia now, as well. I was based in Zagreb. And they were revising their school textbooks. Now, as it happened, while I was in Lancaster, I'd been involved with some teaching at the university there for some, seems a rather strange group of people, but they were Iranian marine engineers. They were all going to work on oil tankers and so on. And we looked around to try and find a textbook to teach them with, but obviously there wasn't a textbook for marine engineers from Iran. So I set about writing materials to teach them. And so that's how I got into the writing business. And on the basis of that, that's how I got the job out in Zagreb, working with the Ministry of Education there, helping them to revise their textbooks, their school textbooks. Well, as it happened, on one occasion, one day while I was out there, I had a phone call from the director of the local British Council, who said, we've got a representative of a British publisher has just turned up, and he wants to know something about English language teaching here in Yugoslavia, as it was. Could you come and speak to him? Well, my initial reaction was, well, I'm quite busy at the moment, but can't your English language officer speak to him? Because they had a dedicated English language officer. But it turns out that he was out of town that day. He was down in Split and doing a seminar down there. So I went to speak to him, speak to this publisher. And it turned out to be a very happy meeting because they were looking for an author, as it happened. They just produced us a textbook for teaching young children, primary school children, and they were looking for somebody to produce the next level, the secondary level, for teenagers. And I turned up with some examples of the things I'd been doing out there, just to try and illustrate what we were doing. And it turned out that they were looking for an author. So he took my materials back to London, and the next thing I knew, I was asked to submit a proposal for a contract and to write the book. And so that's what I did, and I got it. Well, this was a fairly small publisher called Mary Glasgow Publications. And after I got back to England, I was in Zagreb for 3 years. I got back to England. I started writing this book and doing some part-time teaching at Lancaster University as well. Well, about 2 years into doing this, the publisher went bankrupt. and which was not good news, obviously. But as it happened, they sold the contract to Oxford University Press, who were the biggest in the field. And I always like to think this is like somebody who's working for their local football club being given a free transfer for Manchester United or something like that. You know, it's and so they took the project on board, and it was developed into what was originally called Project English, and then there were later editions, Project, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I say it was a roundabout way, but that's the short version.
All right. So which edition is out of the Project English?
There have been 4 editions of Project, but there is a new edition called Project Explore, which I haven't actually written. I acted as a consultant on it because I decided that I didn't really want to be involved full time, because it's pretty much a full-time job. You know, it takes about 5 years to produce a new edition, and I thought, well, do I really want to spend the next 5 years sitting at my desk writing textbooks? So I decided to take a bit of a backseat role on that, and the Oxford University Press got other authors to write it. So of the books that I personally wrote, the 4th edition is, I think, the one that's still mainly in use in the Czech Republic. And then there is this new one, but that only came out last year, so I don't really know how it's doing.
So about the Project English textbooks, where are they used? So I think they are used in former Eastern Bloc. Is it true?
Yes, I would say primarily Central and Eastern Europe, but also much wider than that. In fact, it's used quite extensively in Spain and in Latin America, Argentina, and Uruguay. And there's also an edition that's used in Thailand, a special edition that they did for Thailand. So it is used more widely, but certainly the core market is Central and Eastern Europe. Czech Republic, Slovenia, Croatia, a bit in Poland, not so much because of their system doesn't work quite the same way. Hungary as well, it's quite a big market.
Is the content of the book the same in the whole wide world, or?
Well, 95% I would say is the same, but there are various changes that are made for particular markets, because certain markets insist on certain things, like some markets might, for example, in the early years or the first part of the first year, they want the rubrics for the exercises in the native language, for example.
Oh, I see.
Not just in English. Some other countries, Croatia as an example, they like to have some texts in the book about Croatia, about their students' own country. So obviously you do that, you can't use that book in anywhere other than Croatia. But that's what they want, which is fair enough. It's their country, their education system. And so an edition is done for that. And various countries make similar requests for it.
So are you able to tell how the project books evolved through the 90s and till the Project Explore? Right. How did they change in past 25, 30 years?
That's a question.
That was a bit harsh. I'm sorry about
that. Well, when the first edition, Project English, came out, that was in 1985. Obviously, Central Eastern Europe was not a market in those days, and the book was aimed primarily at private language teaching schools in Greece initially. So the nature of the book was much lighter if you like, because obviously these were students who had been at school all day and were then going to their language schools in the afternoons or evenings. So you didn't really want anything too heavy, because they'd been at school doing other things, doing English and other subjects all morning. So it was a much sort of lighter touch. There were also only 3 levels of it because that was all they required for private language schools. And the other countries became interested in it. Turkey was quite interested, but particularly Spain and Portugal opened up as places where they wanted to use it. So that was its core market. But then, of course, once the Berlin Wall came down and Central Eastern Europe opened up as markets, then it started being used there. But where it was being used there was in state schools, state education, and it really wasn't structured to work in those situations. There weren't enough levels of it for a start. Most countries wanted at least 4, probably 5 levels in many cases, and also it was to be the main core. It wasn't just an extra thing that students were doing in their own time, as it was in the early years. This was the main thing that they were going to learn English from. So it needed a lot of supplementing with grammar exercises and so on. So then when we did the second edition, that was the sort of main changes that were made to the course, was to, first of all, extend it over 5 levels, 4 core levels plus an additional one that some markets wanted, to make it much more regularly structured so that each unit had a set structure to it rather than being much more free-flowing as it was initially. And there had to be much more in the way of vocabulary practice and grammar practice and explanations, pronunciation practice, all sorts of things to make it into a standard English language textbook for schools, to make it fit the system. And they also had to develop tests for it as well. So that's essentially what's happened. And then each new edition has improved on that and brought it more up to date. But of course, in addition to that, you've got the changes that were going on throughout education generally and throughout society generally, which is increasing use of digital media and so on. And this is not just a matter of producing like what were CD-ROMs, although I don't think they do CD-ROMs anymore. It's moved on to streaming these days. But also, what were videos, and then now again, similar sort of thing, streaming. And all sorts of things like that. So digital add-ons, and which were initially they were add-ons, but now, as we've moved on, they're much more closely integrated into the course. But also, of course, you have to change the content of what goes into the book, because the world moves on, things change. One of the classic examples, I think, is where all the pictures, if you go back, I don't even know how far you go back now, but at one time, of course, televisions were huge because they all had the old cathode ray type tubes. And then within maybe 2 or 3 years, everything was flat screens. And so you open the textbook and there's a television.
And nobody recognizes television.
And the kids are saying, what's this? I've never seen one of these before. And of course, the use of mobile phones. The old mobile phones were much bigger. Very few people had them. Then, of course, gradually it got smaller and smaller. More and more people had them. And then suddenly smartphones appear. And social media appears, and all sorts of things are happening, which you have to reflect in your textbook, because you've got to keep it up to date, remembering that the core audience for this, the kids, they're way ahead of the game in this. They know more about the technology than teachers and I do. So you've got to try and keep up with them, because it's very important. I mean, this was one of the main things about project right from the start. It's very important that the book appears to be relevant to the kids, so that they can see their own lives reflected in it, and can see, oh yes, this is meaningful, this is important. So all these things are happening in the background, as well as the other changes specifically relate to project itself.
Let me just ask about the project book, but the project part.
Yeah.
The project part at the end of each unit.
Yeah.
Where did that idea came from?
Well, that, interestingly, that comes from the fact that originally I wasn't a language teacher, I was a history teacher. And projects were used very extensively in history teaching, a way of getting the kids more involved. You know, if you teach history in a sort of these dates and these kings and queens and whatever it might be, and battles, that form of history rather went out of the window many years ago. And when I got involved with teaching history, there was a move towards much more inquiry-based kinds of teaching, and also of getting kids to look at social things as well, development of things in society, so that they could get involved in it much more, and see it as much more relevant. And so that's one of the main means we used to use for that, was getting kids to do projects. They would choose a topic and do a project on a local village, for example, and how it had changed through the years and so on. So in a way, it was the fact that I wasn't originally a language teacher, that I had that experience, that I thought, well, this is a way of helping to make something like history much more relevant to children. Could we use it to do the same thing with language teaching? And so that's how I got the idea, really, is to apply what I'd been doing in history teaching into language teaching, and it seemed to work. And the basic idea of it was to, well, first of all, to get some element of creativity, but mainly the idea is to try and make the language teaching as relevant as possible. And the simple example is that if in a sort of old-fashioned kind of English book, you might read a text about London, right? Well, that's fine. You learn a bit about London, but nobody's going to take, say, a Czech student and say, well, tell me something about London. They're not going to do that, are they? But what they are going to do is they might very well say, well, what's the capital of your country? Tell me something about Prague, or tell me something about your town, Olomouc, or whatever town it might be they're in. And that's what these children are going to be required to, or would need to be able to do, would be to talk about their own lives. So the idea of the project concept is that you have let's say a town, you read a bit about a town in England, and you learn a bit about a town, and in this town, and in doing that, you learn ways of talking about a town, which is the communicative idea. Certain expressions, certain vocabulary, certain language forms that you might need to use for that. And then that moves then into the project where you say, okay, now use this language that you've been practicing in order to talk about your town. And so that's the way of trying to make the language learning as relevant as possible to what the children will need to do. And that works both on a practical level of giving them the language that they will need, but also on a motivational level, in that we're all obsessed with ourselves. We all like to think about our own lives and tell people about our own lives. So there's a high motivational level to it as well. So that's essentially the concept. But it came, as I said, originally from my experience as a history teacher.
Yeah, and to give the students and pupils some kind of background, about the language. Yeah. What do you think is what is the role of a language teacher or English language teacher now in 2020? Is it some kind of different than it was when you started teaching English?
I suppose yes, and this is because I think education generally has become much more complex, in that I think previously you could teach language just as language, if you like. Now, however, you always have to try and think about or bear in mind the socio-political aspect of things like gender equality and so on. And that all comes in to the language teaching, whereas previously I don't think many people gave much thought to that sort of thing. But now it's very much a hot sort of topic, and it certainly makes writing textbooks much more complicated, because you've got to consider sensitivities here and there and balance in this and that to do with race, ethnicity, gender, and so on. And you've got to bear all those sorts of things in mind. And that comes down also to the teacher's level as well, that they have to do that. I think also there's, I don't know if it's the case in the Czech Republic, but certainly here in Britain, I think education teachers have a fairly high sort of social worker kind of role these days, which they didn't really have so much in the past. It was that the kids went to school, the teacher taught them, then they went home, and that was it. Now, teachers are expected to be much more involved in dealing with the social and mental health aspects of children's education in a much more overt kind of way. I mean, a good example, I think, of how it's become much more complicated, which has nothing to do with education. You know that Sean Connery, the original James Bond, has died yesterday, I think it was. And so there's been a lot written about him in the newspapers, things, but and they've been showing a lot of the old Bond films on TV because of lockdown, and there are no new films coming out, so you're getting all the old films. And if you watch those old films, you can see that it was quite easy in the past to decide who the villains were.
Yeah,
right?
okay.
But now you can't do it anymore. You've got to try and get some sort of villain who somehow you think, well, they aren't really a villain, because you're so bothered about, like, for example, you can't make your villain Chinese if you want to sell your film in China. Well, you can't do that anymore, and so on, that sort of thing. So say life's just become much more complex in that respect, because it's a much more integrated world. People think much more about these kinds of socio-political aspects to things, and you have to bear them in mind. And that applies as much in education as it does in all sorts of other aspects of life.
And what do you think about the education in general? Did it change in past years?
Well, yes, it has. And I think that's because there has to be much more emphasis on teaching students how to learn, if you like, because in the past you teach people lots of facts on the basis that those facts were pretty well immortal facts, and that was it. Now, of course, things
you are speaking as a history teacher. Yeah.
Well, yes, but even history has become very problematic these days, but things just change so much that knowledge is accruing exponentially, and so students need to know how to access knowledge, where to find it, how to be able to decide whether it's real, whether it's fake, or whatever, what the provenance of it is, and who wrote it and why, and so on. Much more in the way of critical analysis, this is all comes from the fact of the digital world, where there's so much more information out there. It's increasing all the time. And so students need the skills to be able to cope with that and deal with that, and be able to try and find something close to the truth within it. Whereas I think previously, that really wasn't quite the issue. If you wanted to know something, you found an authoritative book on it and you looked it up and there it was. Now you don't do that anymore. You go on Google and there could be 10 different versions of, or 100 different versions of what you want to know, all telling you different things and giving it different emphasis and so on.
Or even you can write your own.
Yeah, yes. And who knows what the truth is. So you do have to equip young people with the ability to try and work their way through this and try and find out what's true and who wrote it, why, and so on, what motivations were. And so it's much more complex in that respect.
Mm-hmm. And much more difficult, I guess.
Much more difficult, yeah. Yes, it's
ultimate challenge, yeah.
So to be honest, I don't think I would want to be a teacher at the moment. I think it's a much more complex job and much more difficult these days.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether it's the same in the Czech Republic, but certainly here in Britain, it's become much more bureaucratic. Because
I think it's the same, yeah.
Because in the past, teachers would say, "Oh, this is terrible. Go away and rewrite it." Now, you've got to explain why you don't like it and what's wrong with it, and you must avoid any kind of implication that there's something wrong with the student or something like that. Otherwise, you find you've got a legal case on your back, and you're having to try and justify what you've written on this student's work and so on.
Yeah, that's nice to be supported. Yeah. Okay. Now back to you. When you were studying history, back then, or even before that, during your primary or secondary schools, was the history your only journey you were thinking about, to become a history teacher or to become a teacher in general, or was there some kind of other job you wanted to have back then?
No, I think when I was very young, I wanted to be a surgeon, but I didn't go into that. No, to be honest, I didn't really have any idea what I wanted to do for a living. I enjoyed school. I was quite good at it. I enjoyed the academic side of things. I enjoyed learning languages. I enjoyed history and geography, and well, most subjects, in fact. So I think my idea was just to keep going through education as long as possible while I was still enjoying it and learning lots of things. And then sooner or later, something would turn up as to what I should do. This, of course, was way back. This was back in the 70s when there was quite a lot of work around, and you could more or less walk into almost any job you wanted, really, because most training in Britain was done actually on the job rather than beforehand. Mm-hmm. And so I just thought, so I more or less sort of drifted into teaching. I emerged from university with a history degree and thought, well, what shall I do with this? I thought, well, while I'm deciding what to do, I've got to earn a living somehow. And it happened that I was offered a job at a local school. I met the headmaster of the school and he said, oh, well, we actually have a vacancy for a history teacher at the moment. So if you'd like to do that. So I thought, well, I've got to do something. So while I'm deciding what else I want to do, I ended up in education as a history teacher, and I quite enjoyed it. I mean, it was nice. So, and I ended up there.
Okay. What about the situation now? How are you living these days? How are you living through the pandemic? How are you enjoying yourselves?
Well, to be honest, I spend a lot of time playing golf. That's my main hobby. And since I'm not sitting at my desk writing textbooks all the time, I do spend quite a lot of time playing golf. There are still things to do with writing because, as I said, the books are constantly evolving, and every now and again something needs reworking, maybe for a specific market or because something's not wanted anymore. I mean, a classic example of that from the past was Michael Jackson. We had a text about Michael Jackson in the book, and then he got involved in this court, this legal business, and so we didn't really want Michael Jackson in the book anymore, so we had to get rid of him somehow. And of course, now he'd have to be in the past tense. So, so all these sorts of things can happen, you know, that require a certain amount of reworking. So there are certain things to do, but I'm not sitting at my desk producing new things. So I spend a lot of time playing golf. My wife and I, we travel quite a lot, or used to before lockdown, of course. We can't do that anymore. And we have 10 grandchildren, so we would spend quite a lot of time with them, although now that we're back into lockdown, we can't do that anymore. So I read a lot of books, mostly history books. Obviously, history, my first love. So, and go for long walks, and I play guitar as well. So I play some tunes on the guitar every now and again. So.
Is there any book you can recommend you have read recently?
Well, I don't know whether I want to recommend it. Well, there are various books. One I did read. Trying to remember the author now. I can't remember his name. It's called Prisoners of Geography, and it's a fascinating book, and it's related to history as well. But the argument that the writer puts in is that if you want to understand the history of any particular country, you need to look at its geography, and that will give you a very good idea of why it behaves the way it does. A good example would be Britain, for example. The fact that it's an island has much of its history and still does. I mean, right up to today with Brexit.
Yeah.
If you look at a country like Russia, Russia has no natural frontiers, and so is paranoid about its western frontier because Napoleon, Hitler, they've all gone marching in there. And so throughout its history, it's been trying to push its western frontier further and further away from the Russian heartland because of that. And so on, and various other countries as well. He asked, well, not just countries, but continents, in fact, as to why it was that Europe became the sort of big industrialized culture that it did long before other parts of the world. Why not Africa, for example, which has much more in the way of mineral wealth than Europe has? And one of the reasons for that, he argues, is that it's to do with the rivers. Rivers in Europe are all navigable rivers. You can go from one end of Europe almost to the other end, and from north to south, following the rivers. So trade could flow along these things, and you could get a good network. And that would develop trade, and industry follows on from that. If you look at Africa, however, very few of its rivers are navigable. There are rapids, there are waterfalls, and all sorts of things like that, which mean that communication between different parts of the continent is extremely difficult. And so you didn't get these kind of trade networks developing in the same way you did in Europe. So that's a book I found quite fascinating. Prisoners of Geography, it's called, and explains quite a lot about why countries behave the way they do.
Okay, thanks for the tip.
But another book I have read, it's quite an old book now. I got it several years ago, but never actually got around to reading it, but have done because of lockdown. And it's a book by a man called Anthony Beevor about the Battle of Stalingrad, and horrendous things that happened there on both sides. And I mention it because now in our lockdown situation, we complain about this, we complain about that, and the inconveniences and whatever. But if you read a book like that and realize what another generation had to go through, you think, well, actually, it's nothing, really is nothing.
In Stalingrad, it was another kind of lockdown, yeah.
Oh yes, another kind of lockdown. And if the people in front of you didn't shoot you, then the people behind you shot you instead, So, and they had very little food, very little water. It was in the middle of a Russian winter. Unbelievable.
Yeah, I've bought a book, and it is called, or it is dealing with the shapes of the states of the United States.
All right.
And how did the states get their borders?
Yeah.
And so it is kind of similar to the big book you recommended. And also, if you haven't read, I can recommend the book by Henry Kissinger, The World Order.
All right.
And in 8 or 9 chapters, he's dealing with those from the Westphalian peace till now. Yeah, right. And it is quite a it is a thick book, but I can recommend it. Yeah.
All right, I'll have a look at that one. I should probably have plenty of time to read it.
Hopefully not that many.
Not
Tom, thanks very much.
Okay.
It was really pleasant talking to you, and I hope that we'll be able to meet sometime.
Well, I hope so too. Yes.
So enjoy your lockdown. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Yes, and you.
And may your internet connection be stable.
Okay, thanks very much. And,
bye bye. Thanks very much.
Bye bye.